Please help me warmly welcome to stage my panelists, Vimbai Masiyiwa, Mita Vohra, Jameel Verjee, and Mary Gikungu. Fantastic. So let's jump right into it. Rooted in heritage. Very big words. How local cultures shape DNA of African hospitality. I couldn't help myself. I had to start the other way around. When we say shape DNA of African hospitality, what's your take on that definition? What is DNA of African hospitality to you, Vimbai?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us. It's a pleasure to be back at FHS. DNA are the pieces that make us who we are. We've spoken about culture. We've spoken about, land, traditions. I think when we think of the DNA of African hospitality, it's people, it's culture, it's nature. It's all those things coming together to make us uniquely us.
I'm going to come through to you, Mita, ask you the exact same question, because I would like to hear throughout the entire panel what's your take of what DNA in African hospitality, what does that mean? Is there a difference between African hospitality and global hospitality? What is DNA of African hospitality?
I think from my perspective, what I see in that is that there is a connectivity between all the cultures. You can see it in the music. You can see it definitely in the food, in the vibes when you go to the different countries. And most of all, I have traveled so much across Africa, and the people and how warm the people are, I think that is the biggest thing that anyone in Africa has to offer. And it's so genuine. There's so much, like there's churches, there's so much is delivered to each other. When someone is in a painful space, there's so much coming to the table. There's a warmth there, there's a care that for me, I've never seen anywhere else in the world.
Mary, I'm going to come to you and maybe just position the question slightly differently. If you look at the word DNA, we all have DNA. Right? We all have different DNA just on this stage. What makes us the same is that we're all humans, but we're all very different in our DNA makeup. So what is that differentiator in African DNA to you, to the rest of the world?
Thank you very much. From the scientific view, the DNA defines our trait. And the environment that we live in also play a very big role. What I know from African perspective, our African DNA on hospitality is deeply rooted on our cultural values. We are very social in Africa, and we are able to embrace people and live together, despite the challenges that we may encounter on a day-to-day basis.
Same to you, Jameel. Let's hear your take. What is DNA, African DNA in hospitality?
Operating as CityBlue does in 5 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we've gone through the process of understanding the DNA, if you want to call it that, as the ecosystem that we're operating in. And we've had to learn the different environments, the different cultures, and being in the hospitality business, train local staff, of which 99% of our teams comprise. So I think it's the diversity that comprises the continent that I think you mentioned earlier, that we would consider the DNA, and something that we wish to convey in the message of our brand too, which celebrates Africa's diversity.
Okay, and I'm glad I got these definitions, because now it segues us into the conversation. And I'm going to come through to you, Mita. So you have a brand that is born and bred here in Africa. We want to have African brands that are scalable across regions and internationally. So then how do you make sure that we still respect our culture, our heritage, and our DNA when then scaling internationally and regionally without losing that DNA, but you still somehow have to fit into the space that you're scaling into?
Okay, well, I mean, Sarova is very Kenya-centric to start with.
Okay, perfect.
So it's important to just
Sure.
note that.
Sure.
And I mean, for us, we have grown we have 8 properties in the portfolio currently, and we have not actually yet gone into any other markets.
Okay.
So it's a very Kenyan-centric brand where we're also very strong in the segment that we're in at Sarova, and we have a very strong responsibility that we've had. You know, we're a 32-year-old brand, and the cultures within each layer of, you know, Kenyan hospitality is formidable, and keeping that cultural aspect is the single most important thing for someone like me, especially when you're looking in the lodge segments, because there is so much that you can do to enhance people's lives, to create change, actually, you know, in systems. There's so much training that we do regularly for all the different units that we have. It's completely separated. The city is completely in one space, the way the trainings are done there. And then we go through all our lodges. We take on interns very, very intentionally to actually keep this incredible sense of humanity that exists all around us when you're in that space. So I think, you know, we also have beach properties as well. We're in the process of one, and one is White Sands, which has been there for a very long time with us. And now we're thinking, you know, what are the next steps? But we haven't really dived into what they are, because the market has grown very fast for us in the last 2 years. We've had really fantastic years, and hopefully when all this is over with the war, we will be going into a deeper strategy.
Okay, and I hear when we speak about, you know, going global with brands. I'm African, surprise, surprise to anybody who didn't know, born and bred African, and I travel globally. And I'm going to come through to you, Vimbai, because there's something that bothers my heart. A lot of times when we have African brands, they're catering to international visitors. But I'm not necessarily an international visitor. And I think what really bothers me is the fact that we gimmick our local traditions as tokenism. I would go to even some places within South Africa, and I would see how our heritage is tokenized. And I know because it's my heritage too. How do we avoid that? How do we avoid heritage almost looking like a puppet show for Africans? I'm sorry to say it, but we've got to call a spade in order to fix it. What's your take?
Well, I think the first and the simplest way to test this is, as brands, we have to ask ourselves who's benefiting.
That's it.
When we integrate culture into our brands. And if the answer is that it's just our brand, then we've missed the point. And then we have to be really honest about the intent behind wanting to integrate culture and local traditions. And you know, it is a beautiful value add for our properties, but it's also become something that we layer on right at the end of the finished product. So we were sitting in presentations earlier this morning, and someone asked a question, oh, you didn't say anything about sustainable materials that are going to be used to build this property. And I think the other question we should be asking is, who are you speaking to locally?
Right.
Who understands, you know, when we talk about culture, let's unpack that. Who understands the land, what grows from the land, who understands the food, who understands the way of living. You know, we have to bring in community leaders, artisans, storytellers, historians, bring them in right at the beginning of the conversation and make them partners in the project. And you know, we are going to find, and we have to be okay with this, that at some point we have to choose not to commercialize something, and rather respect it and maybe educate our guests about it. But it comes down to, and we say this, this is something that's very common in philanthropy and in community work, is talk to the people before coming and integrating your own brief and like putting in your own project. And it's the same thing that we have to adopt with hospitality. Hospitality is a very much, I think, an educational experience. And it comes from having conversations and respecting that the knowledge of where we're building, we're not the ones who hold it. It's the people who have always existed there.
And that leads me into, let's segue into this question, Jameel. Sometimes as brands, we also allow brands to hire local talent just to tick a box, to say we have a handful of local people. How important is it for brands to actually hire local talent because they want to keep the authenticity of that DNA in that heritage for hospitality, rather than just to say, oh, but we created employment and we did this for local people? Because DNA, you can't learn that stuff. You need to experience it from the people, from the ground. So how important is it to include the locals and hire the talent that's local in order to keep the authenticity?
Very important. So I'll answer that in two ways. The first is our own experience. When CityBlue started in Rwanda, then opened in Uganda, a lot of our senior team were not local talent. And part of that was because we were establishing a new brand in new markets, which we, at that point, were not so familiar with. Subsequently, we've opened in Kenya and Tanzania and so on. And today, I would say that 99% of our teams are deeply rooted here.
Oh, wow.
So we have a very diverse team in terms of background, but they are all African. And I think that's very, very key to the definition of our own culture. The second part of it is the guest experience today. So let's just say that if we rewind to 2013 when we started, I don't think that the guest journey was what it is today, whether it's the digital part of it or the physical part of it. I think today, culturally, there is a need for a guest to have an experience over a luxury bedroom. Immersion in the culture of the environment is very important. So in Uganda, for example, we had a very long-standing relationship with the Nabagaraka Development Foundation, which is the foundation of the Queen of Buganda. Here in Kenya, we have a long-standing relationship with the National Museums of Kenya, which means that if people are in Mombasa or Nairobi, they can have access to the Gedi ruins or the Fort Jesus Museum, or here in Nairobi, various monuments and museums. And part of that is us conveying our local footprint and giving guests those experiences. I also think that ultimately, as a business, and we are business people too, you can outsource housekeeping, you can outsource your call center. As yesterday we announced a new native AI venture. We can outsource a little bit of technology, but you cannot outsource authenticity and culture. And that's why we feel it's so important to represent our DNA.
I'm going to stick with you. And you said, and round of applause on the 99% of the employees being African. But I can't help but think that big decisions on brands are made in a boardroom. It's just the science of business. So you can have employees. How imperative is it to also have people from that local community as part of the ownership team so that they're able to navigate those decisions and respect the authenticity of the environment that they're in?
Sorry, I didn't get the question, apologies. So you're saying, are you talking in terms of the shareholder structure?
Yes, ownership.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I suppose it is very important. And I think the wonderful thing about what I've seen in the years that I've been doing business in this part of the world is that many of the businesses, entrepreneurs are rooted here. They are African. If you look at the hospitality sector generally, you see that more and more. So I think it's very important for that to be encouraged, and I think it's also important for governance and at government level for that to become part of the the incentive package here. So absolutely.
I think we're dealing with the elephant in the room here, and I'm going to come to you, Mary. And I think the elephant in the room is ownership in order to keep heritage and DNA when it comes to hospitality. And I do get that we want brands that are scalable. But I'm going to ask you, for me, that's the elephant in the room. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in hospitality. What do you think is the one challenge that we do have in hospitality in terms of keeping the heritage, but still becoming scalable? And once you explain that one challenge, how do we possibly fix this challenge?
Thank you. I want to start by saying that until we understand the word heritage, until we understand what are the threats that are likely to affect our heritage and authenticity, there will still be a conflict with hospitality.
Right.
And one thing that we do as an institution is to help our communities understand what is heritage.
Right.
Because many people, especially in this country, have always thought heritage is about the Maasai community.
Right.
And the fact that they do not know that there are so many sacred sites, there are so many archaeological sites, there is also natural heritage, and there is also a lot of cultural heritage wherever we go, like what my colleague has said, Fort Jesus. It is that particular space that we need to think about, and then to ask ourselves, have we been able to preserve the same? Because commercialization is one thing that could also bring a conflict in terms of protection. Why I'm saying this is because we have had serious challenges, and I can give examples of what may have happened recently in Kenya. A monument that is 45 years old being brought down by the community because of modernization. Because they want to have newness, but they are losing the meaning of the monument and the authenticity around that monument. And I guess this is something that is happening in many parts of Africa, and it is a big threat to our heritage. And again, as we talk about hospitality, where would we be telling the story if we have changed everything? The other issue that is affecting our heritage and hospitality issue is the climate change. It is real. I give an example of Fort Jesus again. It was falling into the ocean. What did we do? We had to come up with a seawall to protect this particular site. Funding in Africa is a challenge, because if we really have to protect our heritage sites, we must also be supported by our governments. And we must also understand the importance of these monuments as governments and provide support to maintain the same, because this is where the connection with our cultures would come from. For instance, when you go to Kilifi County, for those of us who come from Kenya, we have the sacred Kayas. And there is that Griama community. We had their artifacts being taken away during the colonial times. And one of the things that we are trying to do, because we have to decolonize ourselves. We talked about our artifacts being in those countries that our colonizers came from. But the issues of preserving and understanding the importance of those artifacts is so important to us as African continent.
I like the word, yes, please feel free. I like the word preservation. We need to preserve. And I'm going to come through to Vimbai. We can't run away from the fact that Africa can't be left behind. And I'm going to go into a word that's thrown around globally that Africa also needs to keep up with: wellness, because it matters. But it doesn't mean that when we then offer wellness in Africa, it needs to be yoga or, the things that other countries do that respect their heritage. How do we start taking global concepts but include in a respectful way restorative practices in order to keep the African DNA coming in hospitality? Because wellness is a big section of hospitality.
Yeah, wellness has also been one of the big buzzwords I've heard here.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I think we need to look at it in terms of it's not just spa treatments and a spa menu,
Right.
some Ayurvedic yoga, which to be honest doesn't make sense for us in Zimbabwe. Why would somebody fly all the way to Zimbabwe to do an Ayurvedic yoga retreat when you can go to where that came from? So we have to look at what's the way that people live, how do they connect, and how does it relate to the community? And again, that comes back to the point I was making before, which is we get this information through conversation. I'm always struck by, I'm Zimbabwean. I lived there until I was 5, and I spend a lot of time going back to Zimbabwe. But the amount that I learn in terms of, how plants are used, how different ingredients are used that I've never thought of in, the global West context is always so fascinating to me. And for us as a business, we've been looking at how do we integrate some of those things into the way of life when people come to our property. So when you're going on a safari walk and you need to reset your mind, you need something restorative, what is it that you're stopping to smell? What is the movement that you're doing that, local communities do in terms of exercise? Everybody exercise, they move in some way. And I think we've just gotten used to seeing how people do it in other parts of the world, that there's a part of us that cuts out how we do it, how our parents have always done it, how our grandparents have always done it. But I think at the end of the day, this all comes down to what I said before. It's conversation. Having conversation with locals, understanding that your teams and your staff, they contribute more than their skills. They contribute knowledge. And respecting that.
Mita, I'm going to ask you this question. If there's one element you think we need to change in order to preserve heritage that we need to hand down to the next generation, what is it?
Can I just, before that, just explain something?
I have to keep time as well.
Okay.
I have to be strict to myself too.
Okay, sure. Just say the question again.
What's the one element that you think we need to keep or to change, that we need to pass down to the next generation in order to preserve our heritage and our DNA in hospitality?
So, I mean, for me, it's when you're kind of given these gifts of being able to even be in a national park, because that's not an easy feat. And we also have a partner in the business who is Kenyan, who is Maasai, and is a very big part of all the decision making and all the process. So I think that part is extremely important. Whichever brand you are, it's a very important part of that system, because you will lose so much if this starts degenerating. Because actually, when you come to Kenya, you can, well, to many parts of Africa actually, you can see so many different things. The layers within just your own, like we have a 50-acre space, and the layers in which we take kids around to see all the different kinds of plants, all the different kinds of animals are like read to them in the books and stuff, and the adults kind of get this huge break out of that as well. However, there's so much understanding from them, of what are the things that the Maasai do, and separately, what are the things that we do, in Sarova Pan-Afric as a completely different experience altogether. So I think there is actually a lot of that already happening in many of the lodges, who have been there for a very long time. So yes, there is a spa, but there is also so much in the property that we show you, telling you about every tree, or doing a wedding there, or, so it is actually very active.
Thank you. And I'm glad you answered that not just from a African perspective, but you went deep diving into Kenya. I've only got a chance for one more question. I'm going to come through to you, Jameel. If we're doing this preservation of heritage right and the DNA in hospitality if we're really going to do it correctly for Africa, what do you think the one trend should become that we should watch out for?
The one threat.
The one trend.
Trend. Look, for it to be sustainable, there has to be income. And for there to be income, I would suggest that all businesses look towards working with their communities in a manner that allows some form of revenue share. So if a business is rooted in Harare, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Kigali, wherever it is, it should look for local businesses, sister businesses within the vicinity to share its guests' experiences with. In our case, it's with the national museums in some capacity. We send our guests for night tours. We send our guests to immerse in not just in Kenya, the bush and the beach that people know about, but also the incredible museums that they have. But in every ecosystem we're in, we should be participatory to ensure that sustains and generations can also benefit from our presence.
Thank you for that, and I'm glad. Yeah, you can clap for him. I heard the clap coming. I like that we're finishing off there. We need to remember that before we're fascinated about being global as Africans, we've got to be proud of this ecosystem. First, build our own ecosystem before we try to fit into other ecosystems. Because I do believe that we are in an era where it's not just for Africans. We need to actually focus on an era where it is for Africans, by Africans, and then we focus on globalizing from there on. So a round of applause, please, for my panelists. This is Vimbai, Mita, Mary, and Jameel as they make their way